We screamed into space and heard the echo. Part D, My Sacrifice. 2532, EIC Frigate Pegasus, Saturn Space. Report. Rear Admiral Rayner barked unnecessarily as the information was summarized on the main screen in front of everyone, but he wanted to hear it from his subordinates directly. We are on deceleration approach to Mimas. Nothing to report within the target zone, Commander Grover announced, but was nudged mentally by Syl, who swiped an AR panel over to his viewport with the pertinent information. Correction, Grover continued, there are anomalous natural satellites in orbit near the target zone. Analysis confirms they are made of ice that matches those found in Saturn's rings. Each is approximately 6 to 10 meters in diameter. Ignore them, Rayner ordered. An ice miner must have discarded them, accidentally or otherwise. What of Epsilon itself? There has been no further communication outgoing from the station since we received Dr. Pericle's warning. We are receiving the analysis of the station now. Grover's expression turned grim. It is as she said, the station is showing early signs of the echo. The station has been infected. Rayner wanted to swear. History was repeating itself, but this time it was worse. The project he had shoved so many resources into was on that station, and now it was as good as lost. Again. His plan had been simple, become Admiral and then find a place on the EIC Board of Directors. He could feel his ambition slipping away if he did nothing. He didn't swear but beat a fist against the armrest of his chair. All his efforts would go to waste, and along with it, his promotion to Admiral. But there was still a chance to salvage the situation. Send a Priority 1 message to EIC Command, relay that echo infestation has been confirmed on EIC Correctional Facility Epsilon. EIC Frigate Pegasus will commence Echo Protocol 1, quarantine and complete annihilation of infected assets. Rayner might not be able to provide the EIC with a weapon to win the war, but he will make sure he wins this battle against the Echo, which may itself be enough to be promoted to Vice Admiral. That alone would be a feat in this backward system humanity once called home. Deploy jamming buoys around the station. Prepare an antimatter torpedo. We will ensure not a single nanoparticle of Echo remains in existence. It is unfortunate that we will lose all EIC personnel on board the station, but it is far better to end their existence swiftly than let them suffer as they are corrupted and changed by the Echo. Buoys deployed and jamming in progress, Grover relayed as he swiped the air in front of him to pass on orders to the crew. Bringing Pegasus into a holding pattern. Rayner waited, tension building, as he anticipated the following words from this executive officer. Torpedo ready. Captain Rayner gave the order that would annihilate the station and all souls on board at an atomic scale. Fire. 2532, EIC Jailhouse Epsilon, Mima's Orbit, Saturn. Amy remembered. Rayner. Syl rage engulfed her and scoured through her. The bastards had taken away her family and left her with nothing. She would have her revenge against them and the crew of the Pegasus and all of EIC. With a scream from the very core of her being, she attacked the nearest to her. She clawed and bit, subconsciously mimicking the Canid, as she threw herself bodily at Dimitri. But she was no Canid and flailing attacks were ineffective, but still she continued. If she had been thinking, she might have done something else, but there was no thought, only violence. Dimitri, with an unamused expression, wrapped a tentacle around her and hoisted her away from himself and the blur of movement that was Gerald. The tentacle squeezed the breath out of her, causing spots to dance in her vision when, with a silver-black flurry of movement, she was floating free. Amy sucked in air and blinked away her impaired vision in time to see the wolf-headed and bulked-up Gerald tearing into Dimitri, severing another tentacle and then another in a cold meticulous fury. Amy struggled in midair, trying to move in any direction, but ended up revolving in place. She was not used to zero gravity and had to find a way to get back onto the ground. She took stock of the situation. Gerald was being grappled by more Dimitri tentacles, which were subsequently torn up, after which Dimitri created even more tentacles and the cycle continued. At least Dimitri looked like he was having fun, judging by his maniacal laughter. Amy turned her attention to Harvey, who was attending to her toy paladin. Harvey was saying, "Sue? Are androids supposed to sweat black oil?" You don't look that great. While he was reaching out to touch her and then pulling his hand back as if burnt, you are freezing cold. His worry would almost be touching if Amy didn't have her own problems. It was true that Sue's body was burning up with a strange cold heat that Amy could feel even at a distance. Droplets of dark ink had begun to weep from the android's skin, while the android's mental state was one of chaotic delirium. Her hair was still making pretty blue lights. Not Amy's problem. She needed to get down. Amy's vision went white as if someone had set off fireworks inside her eyeballs, but the sparkling pinpricks of light quickly subsided, leaving her wondering what that had been while the station itself groaned and creaked around her. Still next to Sue, Harvey said, "They got here much sooner than I thought. EIC response times to echo infestations are insane." Did that mean it was some kind of weapon that the EIC was using to destroy the echo? If so, they had clearly failed, since everyone was still alive and well. A sharp slap and a whine was heard as a tentacle sent Gerald spinning across the hall to slam into the wall next to Harvey and Sue with a bone-crunching splat. Amy mentally corrected herself by crossing off the welder part of alive and well. Amy caught a severed tentacle that was drifting past her and threw it as hard as she could at the ceiling, causing her to drift to the floor. Once her feet touched the ground, she stood triumphantly, took a final look at the disgusting ooze monster that Dimitri had become, turned, and then she sprinted to the door as fast as she could. What else was she supposed to do? Ask the monster to give up nicely? She didn't want to be a vessel for any god's rebirth, and there was no guarantee that she would remain herself. She had better things to do, and she would do them in her own way. A moaning figure floated between Amy and the exit. She did not hesitate to kick them away with a shout, "Get out of my way, Marcus!" There were no more infected to block her escape, so she ran. As she fled, she heard Harvey shout, "Wake up, Gerald! This is no time for a nap." Gerald groaned a reply, "Is it only me, or is the moon getting bigger?" 2532, EIC frigate Pegasus, Mima's orbit, Saturn. Captain! One of the ice satellites has changed course. It is accelerating to intercept the warhead. Shoot it down. It won't make her. I said shoot it down with the main weapon. Now. Firing main weapon, Grover replied snappily and swiped the authorizations on his AR. The screen showed the laser firing through the chunk of ice with pinpoint accuracy, causing it to fracture into smaller chunks of ice that were all still on a trajectory with the Pegasus missile. Course correct the missile. Rayner ordered. Cannot comply. Sil was the one that answered this time. We are jamming our own signals, so the missile was fired under self-navigation with detonation on impact. The main screen showed the basic navigation AI on the missile with its payload of suspended antimatter attempting to dodge the bits of ice, but only succeeded in steering straight into a large piece. The missile detonated on impact as it was instructed to do, unleashing the antimatter from its prison, and where it touched anything else, it annihilated itself, releasing incredible amounts of energy. The main screen turned white for a split second before visuals returned. Flecks of light danced in Rayner's sight, but he blinked them away. Shielding holding, Captain, Grover reported as the main screen displayed nothing where the intervening ice had been. What the hell just happened? Acting Captain Rear Admiral Rayner bellowed. Someone tell me what just happened. Red blips appeared on the main screen coming from around the remaining errant ice satellites that had also inexplicably turned towards the Pegasus. Plumes of rocket engines firing from the previously hidden ships no larger than a four-seater vehicle. Goblins, Sil said unimpressed. 2532, Goblin Armada, Mima's orbit, Saturn. Yeehaw crackled over the local communication channel between the Goblin ships that looked like dented bubbles strapped to the front of a misshapen rocket. Let's not have Joel's sacrifice be in vain. Hawk yelled over the shared channel. Right, the other four goblins sound off over each other in reply. Jub. Jib. Go around left. Reeb and Clyde take the right. Hawk ordered, we will do that scorpion move where you are the pincers and I'll be the tail. Which left is right? Jib interjected. No, left is right. Only right is right. Your other right. Reeb replied, trying to help. Right. Jib answered back. Stop being such shazbrains and throw the ice at them. Hawk reprimanded them. Right, 3 goblins said in unison. They released the ice they had grabbed onto to go hurtling at the Pegasus. Where is Reeb? Our comms don't work if he's out of line of sight. Never mind, he'll turn up again later. Anyway, we only need to hold on until old Nib says he is ready. Hawk continued and turned to look at his green-skinned passenger that was hunched over hammering at something sticking out the side of Hawk's ship. Are you ready yet, old Nib? Almost there, youngin. Almost there, old Nib muttered back. Don't rush an old goblin. He continued hammering with a wrench. You aren't that much older than me, Nib. Just because you decided to grow a beard does not make you old. Hawk retorted, suddenly pulling the ship into a new direction as the block of ice in front of him exploded from the accurate laser fire from the Pegasus. Hawk's ship skipped through the debris field without taking much damage. Just hurry up. Don't get too close, Hawk reminded his goblin fleet. We can't dodge their quick rockets up close. We can't dodge their beam of light either, Job retorted. We have been doing well so far, Reeb said. A laser struck Clyde's ship, puncturing it and causing it to implode. Clyde! No! Jib shouted. Those bastards! You just had to say something, didn't you, Reeb? Dodge, dodge, dodge. Job screamed as a multitude of mini-rockets whizzed past his bubble. Who said this plan was going to work? We are all going to die. Trust me, Hawk replied as he maneuvered behind a woefully small piece of ice to use as a shield. We got this. 2532, EIC Jailhouse Epsilon, Mima's Orbit, Saturn. Having dodged past the milling inmates that seemed more interested in Sue than herself, Amy left the observatory and sprinted down a corridor. Amy struggled with her dress that had become an unruly fluttering cloth thanks to her sudden motions, and she bunched it into a fist and turned her mind to more important matters. She was beginning to wonder if she needed a better plan of escape when a ghostly visage of Xandra appeared next to fleeing Amy and floating alongside her without a word. Amy sensed there was no mind there to read. Maybe she was finally going insane, and she decided she was fine with that. The ghost Xandra pointed to a circular doorway where the iris door had been forced out of its setting. Amy jogged inside. She stopped in front of a console that looked familiar to her. This was similar to the jump drive on the Aspro, one she had watched Xandra use many times before. Xandra had talked her through the process. First, check the surroundings. The instrumentation showed a few small ships in the vicinity that were of no consequence and a larger ship. A warship. The readout didn't need to tell her the ship's name as Amy recognized it. The Pegasus. Anger took hold of her once more as thought of all that ship had taken from her. Not just her family, but their memories as well. A translucent hand was placed on her shoulder, calming her and letting her focus on the job at hand. Her anger subsided to the background for the time being. The next step of what she had to do was more difficult. Her mind opened to space and she saw the solar system. Not just Sol, the planets, and their moons, but also how they each warped the space-time around them. In that instant a sense of clarity overcame her as she adjusted the instrumentation in front of her, changing the destination of what she had assumed before to be a station. The truth was that the entire jailhouse was a starship with near light-speed capabilities, and she would have her revenge, starting with Dimitri and his minions. 2532, EIC Jailhouse Epsilon, Mima's Orbit, Saturn. Harvey was vaguely aware that Amy had scampered away, dodging between the crowd and out the door, like Gerald when he was called for a bath. He wouldn't have stopped her even if he could. His priority here was Sue. He glanced up from where he was tending to the android. Gerald had been correct. The grey moon was getting larger. That wasn't right. It took him a moment to comprehend that the moon wasn't moving at all, but it was the station that was falling towards it. What's going on? Harvey said out loud while Gerald pulled himself off the wall with a snarl of agony. On, the crowd repeated. Goblins, Sue said through lips quivering from the cold. The flashing lights. I am sure it was them. Was them. Them. As if on cue, a goblin craft drifted past the outside of the observation dome, a goblin clearly visible in the bubble-like cockpit while a light blinked rhythmically alongside him. The goblin looked up at them and gave a thumbs up, while the people under the dome were perfectly reflected in the mirror paneling behind the goblin's command capsule. Dimitri craned his head back to watch the small vessel drift by, gazing at his own reflection. Taking advantage of the momentary distraction, Gerald lunged at Dimitri once more and took off the monster's head with a sweep of his claws. Decapitation did not prevent Dimitri from continuing to laugh silently, though his tentacles flailed mindlessly, grazing Gerald with their wild swings. The canid grabbed onto one and was being waved about like a hairy placard at a goblin protest rally. "Who called the goblins?" Harvey asked, watching the goblin go by, noting the light flashed in a regular pattern. It was a communication of some kind that he couldn't understand, but Sue could decode it. Of course she could, she was an android. "The goblins." "Goblins," the mob mumbled. Sue raised a cold hand. "They are repaying a debt." She shivered. "Adept." "Inept," the crowd muttered around them, keeping their distance thanks to Sue's azure glowing hair, their echoes really grating on his nerves. Harvey glanced at Sue, who was looking worse and worse. From the oily perspiration, black ice had started to form over her skin, and the coldness around her had spread so much that he had to take a few steps back. It was like she was sucking up all the heat around her. What should he do? The cerulean light emanating from Sue's hair was keeping the echo infected away, but it was killing her. If he saved Sue, they would all become echo food, but if he didn't, she would die and they would all perish anyway. He had to think of a way out before the crowd's constantly yammering drove him to develop his own psychosis. He scratched an itch on his arm and noticed his skin was starting to turn grey there. It was too late. To Harvey's surprise, Sue stood up, pointing a hand to where the monstrous Dimitri and Gerald were wrestling, the headless monster still more than a match for the tiring canid. Black motes gathered, twisting and curling out of the air like a thick coalescing smoke, forming a purple metal and wicked-looking sword in Sue's grasp while her hair blazed brighter. At a loss for words, Harvey stared, mouth agape. 2532, a few days ago, Lown. One moment, Lown had been struck by that strange purple lightning, and the next, he was waking up with a human in a brown coat, salt and pepper stubbly jaw and bad breath pouring and fawning all over him. Lown had wanted to scream and push the human away, but his arms felt heavy and he couldn't move. A painful tingling sensation passed through him like he had struck his funny bone, but it was every part of him from his neck down was prickling. The upside was that he could move again and he could finally get away from the human, but he suddenly didn't want to. This was the first time in a long while someone had actually cared for him and treated him like more than dirt on the station floor. He knew there must be a reason, but he felt like he wanted that kind of attention to last, even if it was a lie. Lown finally looked down at himself and found he was attached to a very good-looking human body. He gave the breasts an experimental squeeze before shoving both his hands to his sides. He was just confirming that they were his. He gave a quick excuse. He blinked and looked around him. An apartment about as big as his, but it was cleaner and had better stuff. Also, there was a canid sitting on a female human. That was strange. Canids were bad news for goblins, so Lown was rightfully afraid, but he had to keep pretending. When the human man began calling him Sue, he knew that something was definitely wrong. He wanted to deny it. He wasn't this Sue person, but at a glance at his name tag, he knew it would require a lot of explaining and he didn't have the answers. So he kept quiet and played along. He was now the android Sue, but how should he behave? Ladylike. Sue appeared ladylike, so he did his best by being demure and pouted his lips and, he knew, had no idea what he was doing. But when the human called Harvey accused Amy of crushing goblin eggs, Lown lost it. Clutch smashing wasn't uncommon even if some places banned it. In EIC-run stations, an unsanctioned batch could be destroyed without any repercussions. He didn't know how anyone could have so little respect for a species to crush their unborn children, even if they children were a little rowdy and caused trouble until they were taught better. Lown wanted to smash the human female's face in. So he tried. The canid, called Gerald, who hadn't even been in the room a moment ago, stopped him. The wolfman's closeness brought back fears of what canids could do to goblins. Then Harvey was holding him. It felt strangely nice to be held for once. All the anger and the will to fight had left Lown, leaving him feeling confused as to how he had gotten here in the first place. From then on, Lown played along. He was glad Amy went to jail, and then Harvey and scary dogman called Gerald showed Lown to Sue's apartment. The apartment was not as nice as Amy's was, but it was far better than his old one. It was going to take a while to get his mind around the fact that he was Sue now. Lown had done his best to wave Harvey goodbye while being friendly, but not so much that he tried to stay, because then the canid would stay too, and Gerald still scared Lown. Lown scoured Sue's apartment, which was only a slight step up from a goblin's in terms of ragged second-hand decor. At least it had a bed. No window though, but that was understandable since only the fancy ones had windows. That was when he found it, her ink-deck diary. Why an android didn't keep a proper digital diary was beyond Lown, but the neat writing in the diary's electronic pages filled him in on her hopes and dreams and her life in general, although there was no mention of her being an android at all. It seemed more like the diary of an ordinary woman. Maybe she was one of those mind transfers, though those were expensive and not always legal depending on how it was done. It was usually far outside what a goblin could afford. Armed with the information from the diary, he went to work as Sue, remembering to feed the cats in the alley along the way. Lown smiled at the canid security guard and said a kind hello to the female humans, Monica and Erica, as well as the robot receptionist Rita, who all knew Sue. He grinned and bet it as some ugly human felt his butt. She quickly made excuses to get away and found his way to Sue's cubicle. After fumbling with the AR glasses for longer than he cared to admit, he finally got into her assignments and cat images. It frustrated him that the assignments had no names, only jumbled letters and symbols, but even so Lown recognized one set of data as belonging to EIS-49, the place he grew up on. The investigation into the accident said one thing he knew to be false. The report said it was a hydrogen detonation, but the facility didn't store hydrogen. It was silly. The writer of the report had obviously never set foot on Europa. Sue's analysis into the investigation did raise the possibility of an antimatter warhead detonation with 89% probability. The investigation halted there as Sue didn't know where in the system EIS-49 was. But Lown knew and quickly brought up the list of all ships that could have an antimatter warhead and be in the vicinity of Europa at the time. There was only one matching ship, the Pegasus. The Pegasus was first to arrive at the accident and reported finding no survivors. Not only that, but Pegasus had been in the space around Europa multiple times preceding the incident and had never returned since. On a whim, Lown decided to check what the Pegasus had been doing recently. Expected patrol lines around Earth with some visits to Mars and Venus, but what did stand out were multiple visits to Epsilon Correctional Facility around Saturn. The jailhouse visits began not long after the EIS-49 incident. Lown didn't know exactly what the Pegasus had been up to, but he could guess it was no good. It might have had something to do with the researcher on EIS-49. He remembered her name was Jenny something or other. He couldn't remember exactly, but pulled up all records for researchers named Jenny, but found the matching image to have died many years before he had met Jenny. That line of inquiry was a dead end, but Epsilon itself would hold answers. As Sue, Lown booked a shuttle flight to the jailhouse station with the excuse of seeing Amy, but he actually wanted to snoop around to see if there was anything strange going on. Just in case, Lown called in the favor with the goblins as himself. If he needed to escape the station other than by using the official shuttle, they would be helpful. There was a small chance they would have to face off against the Pegasus, so he gave them the one piece of evidence the Pegasus was involved in all of this, the black cylinder he had stored in the Europa spaceport. When he saw the schematics for the cylinder, he recognized it immediately. The cylinder he had all this time was an undetonated antimatter warhead. Thankfully its antimatter containment matrix could last for decades, or the starport might have been in trouble. He wouldn't have the time to fetch the warhead himself, but the goblins could. He trusted his fellow goblins to fetch the warhead and prepare it in any way they saw fit. Barbara was clever and would know what to do with it. Lown felt a little guilty in never meeting the goblins in his new body, though he was sure they would understand that Shaz happened and see his inner goblin, he still didn't want anyone to know. Not yet. He did have the foresight to tell them to pick up a woman that gave them the secret password. The whole operation excited and frightened Lown, and he wondered if this is what spies felt like before their big secret missions. 2532, EIC Jailhouse Epsilon, Mima's Orbit, Saturn. Lown stood, black ice flaking off Sue's, now his, android body, and he brandished his sword with its pointed pommel and antler-like guards. His body was at once feeling sluggish and more energetic. Like he was brimming with raw power while also feeling like he was under a heavy gravity. Lown was not a plaything for Dimitri to discard once he found someone else. He wasn't a nobody that could be fed to the echo. All his life he had been told he was less than nothing, and after a while he had begun to think nothing of himself. What had he planned to accomplish in the end? It was like his choices didn't matter. But would he have chosen differently at any point along the way? No. Everything he did he chose as best he could. Without regret. But he now regretted believing in others' biased and incorrect opinions and that he didn't do better by himself. Only Harvey had cared, and then only because he was in Sue's body. Even in UVR, he was pushed around and eventually discarded for something considered superior. Lown would show Nick what he was capable of if it was the last thing he did. The android stepped forward unsteadily while the canned and oozing headless Dimitri traded blows. Lown ran forward with the sword raised as it sucked more darkness from the air around them, before it was knocked out of his hand by an errant tentacle. Lown watched the dark blade clatter against the floor and bounce up to hover above the ground uselessly. Like him. He was useless after all. The next tentacle slapped him across his face and he landed heavily next to the suspended sword, his shoes keeping himself from drifting away. He wasn't a fighter. Even with all this power he had received, he was still far from adequate. He wasn't enough. A memory bubbled up from the dark recesses of his mind. It was Jenny's voice. He remembered her saying, "Lown. Lown, you shouldn't be playing down here. Yes, it is a very pretty blue gem. It's the very crystallization of a bose. Never mind. You wouldn't understand. Think of it as the heart of a star. If it broke it could destroy the whole of Europa, so be careful. There is no need to cry, a little bump won't break it. Have another sweet." It became clear. There was only one thing he could do. Lown plucked the sword out of the air and stood shakily. He would unleash everything that was inside him, everything that he had. "I will entrust it all to you. Give them hell," Sue's voice told Harvey. Lown turned the blade to point at himself and stabbed the gem through his own chest. Comment if you liked that twist in this chapter. Subscribe if you would like to hear more. Thank you for your support.